So back in November 2022, a peace deal was signed, officially putting an end to Ethiopia's brutal 2-year war in the Tigray region. The guns went silent. But here's the thing. Peace is so much more than just the absence of war. And what's happening now, well, it's this incredibly complex, contested story about justice and accountability. And that story, let me tell you, is far from over.
Okay, to really get what's at stake here, you have to start with this number. An estimated 600,000 people died. Just let that sink in for a second. This isn't some statistic from a dusty history book. We're talking about a massive open wound that's shaping every single part of Ethiopia's present and, its future. It's the backdrop for every single challenge on the long road to recovery.
All right, so here's the quick timeline. The war kicks off in November 2020. Fast forward 2 years, and they sign a peace deal. It's called the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement, or COHA for short. So officially, the fighting stops. But what's left behind? It's what people are calling a fragile peace. It's just full of tension, and there's still conflict simmering. And that really brings us to the core question we're trying to unpack here. If the war is supposed to be over, why does real peace feel, well, nowhere in sight?
So to try and answer that, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. We'll look at what's actually happening on the ground after the war, then dive into the government's kind of flawed plan for justice. After that, we'll see how civil society is getting squeezed, how storytellers are being silenced, and finally, what that long, steep road to recovery looks like.
So the peace deal, it came with some big promises. A really key one was that all foreign and non-federal forces were supposed to withdraw. But the thing is, that just hasn't fully happened. You've still got Eritrean and Amhara forces occupying parts of Tigray. And get this, even as that war officially ended, these other devastating conflicts just blew up in other regions, like Amhara and Oromia. So the country is just stuck in this cycle of violence, even with a peace deal written down on paper.
All right, so how do you even begin to address the atrocities of a war like this? The government's official answer is this policy they call transitional justice. And, in theory, that's exactly how a country is supposed to heal. But in practice, this plan is hitting a huge, huge wall of distrust.
So you might be asking, what even is transitional justice? Well, think of it like a toolkit, right? A toolkit for a society that's trying to recover from something horrific, like mass violence. It's got everything in it, from court trials to truth commissions, and it's all designed to do a few key things. Hold the people who did this accountable, give some kind of justice to the victims, and make sure these kinds of horrors can never happen again. It's supposed to be the blueprint for rebuilding a broken society.
And this is where we get to the government's really controversial move. They've decided the entire process is going to be domestic only. What that means is all accountability, every bit of it, will be handled by Ethiopia's own institutions. No international judges, no hybrid courts. They're explicitly ruling that out. And that decision right there is really the core of this whole problem. And this number just says it all. It shows you the massive credibility gap we're talking about. A survey found that 98% of Tigrayans, who were the primary victims of this war, have zero trust in their own country's justice system to hold anyone accountable. Let me say that again, 98%. It begs the question, right? If the very people the system is supposed to serve have absolutely no faith in it, how on earth can it possibly work? So where does all this distrust come from? Well, when you talk to critics and civil society groups, they point to 4 main things. First off, a lot of the same officials who were in charge during the war, they're still in power. Second, victim groups from Tigray say they were totally left out of the process of even drafting this policy. Third, if the plan is domestic only, what about the crimes committed by Eritrean forces? There's just no clear way to get justice for that. And finally, there's this really widespread belief that the courts in Ethiopia just aren't independent, that they're subject to political pressure.
And listen to this warning from a former UN investigator, because it really gets to the heart of what people are afraid of.
The concern is something he calls quasi-compliance. The idea that you create a justice process that looks totally legitimate on paper, but it's really just a performance, a show put on to get the international community to back off and stop scrutinizing. And of course, a performance like that would leave the victims with absolutely no real justice.
Okay, so if you can't trust the official process, who do you turn to? You need independent watchdogs, right? In Ethiopia, that essential job falls to what we call civil society organizations, or CSOs. They're the ones who are supposed to be the voice for the victims, the ones holding the government's feet to the fire. But, and this is a huge but, as we're about to see, those very watchdogs are being systematically weakened. You see, it wasn't always this grim. After some big legal reforms back in 2018 and 2019, there was this incredible surge of hope. The space for these groups just opened up, and suddenly you had about 250 new CSOs focused on peace building, registering all over the country. It really felt like a moment of genuine promise.
But that promise, it's pretty much faded. In late 2023, the government just suspended several of the country's most vital human rights organizations. We're talking about these really prominent vocal groups. That move sent a crystal clear message, and it created what activists call a chilling effect. Basically, an atmosphere of fear where people are afraid to speak out. And it's not like these groups aren't trying. They're organizing. You have this coalition of 72 different organizations in Tigray, for example. But they're just being sidelined. They have repeatedly asked to be part of the official teams that are supposed to be monitoring the peace deal, and they've been completely shut out. What does that do? It leaves this massive void, right where independent oversight is needed most. So we've talked about CSOs. The other critical group of watchdogs, of course, is journalists. And look, if you thought the environment was tough for civil society, the story for the press is just as bleak, if not worse. The people who are just trying to report the truth on the ground are facing a reality that's getting more and more dangerous by the day. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can see it right in the data. According to Reporters Without Borders, Ethiopia's ranking in the World Press Freedom Index just plummeted. It fell all the way to 130th in 2023. And a drop like that isn't just a statistic. It represents a really rapid, really dangerous collapse of the entire environment for journalists. Behind that number, though, are these just harrowing personal stories. Take Akbaret's Ghebreselassie. She was a journalist for Tigray TV, and she was trying to keep reporting from the mountains during the war. She was eventually detained by security forces, and after being psychologically tortured, she said this, quote, "One thing I knew for sure right then was that my life would never be the same." In the end, she had to flee Ethiopia. And you'd think fleeing the country would mean you're safe, right? But not always. Here's another journalist, Barihu Gezai. He managed to escape to Uganda, but just listen to what he says. "I am not free. People who claim to be Ethiopian and Eritrean spies here threaten and follow me every day." It just shows you the incredible reach of the forces that are trying to silence these stories. The fear follows them. So let's be clear, this isn't some abstract threat. We're talking about documented cases of arbitrary arrests and physical attacks. And the consequences can be fatal. Journalists like Dawit Kebede Araya have actually been killed for doing their jobs. The risk of just telling the story in Ethiopia today, it's literally a matter of life and death. So when you have a situation where justice is being denied and the truth tellers are being silenced, that road to recovery becomes incredibly, incredibly steep. The war has left these deep, deep wounds on, well, everything, from people's personal safety all the way to the national economy. So the big question becomes, what does recovery even look like in a situation like this? One of the most horrific wounds, and this is difficult to talk about, comes from the widespread and systematic use of sexual violence. As this health coordinator explains, this wasn't random. It was a calculated weapon of war. It was used to terrorize, to humiliate, and to literally destroy the fabric of society. Survivors have reported attackers using the most chilling language imaginable, stating that their intent was to make sure Tigrayan women could never have children again. I mean, that's an attack on the very future of an entire people. And then there's the economic devastation, which was just immense. Businesses were destroyed, supply chains completely shattered.
According to experts, a recovery needs a really practical, multi-step approach. And it all has to start with a genuine political settlement. You can't rebuild on a shaky foundation. From there, it's about rebuilding from the ground up. We're talking about things like creating special recovery funds, setting up business support centers, and painstakingly fixing all those broken supply chains.
So what can the rest of the world do? Well, human rights groups have a pretty clear list of what they're asking for. First, they're saying push for some kind of international element in the justice process. Something to make it credible. Second, establish clear benchmarks so we can actually measure if the domestic process is working. Third, demand unfettered humanitarian access for everyone who needs it. They also say to keep pushing for political solutions to the other ongoing conflicts in Amhara and Oromia. And finally, demand public reporting and proof that the peace deal is actually being followed.
And all of this brings us right back to where we started. There's a peace deal on paper, sure, but real, lasting peace? That requires justice. It requires truth. It requires accountability. And so we're left with this final, really difficult question. How can a nation possibly build a future when the very tools you need to build it, justice and truth, are the very things being threatened?